Hello, welcome to your second pre-lab video. My name is Dr. Crosswhite, and I'll be going over classification of tissue and the integumentary system. So the first half of this talk is going to feature classification of tissues, or aka histology, and the second half will cover the integumentary system, or the skin. So let's start with the classification of tissues, or exercise 6 from your lab manual. I'm going to move pretty quickly through the various types of tissue, and that's because I want you to really work on in lab this week using those microscope slides and identifying the various types of tissue underneath the microscope as opposed to relying on this video. Okay. So histology is another term that you might hear your professor or TA say, because histology is the study of cells and tissue, and we're talking on a microscopic level here. The reason it's important is because histology is really the structural basis of anatomy and organ physiology. When we know how something is organized or structured, it gives us a hint at how that tissue or organ could function. Now, the classic definition of tissue is a group of cells with similar structure and function. And a question I'm going to ask you right now, but not go into, is how is that different than an organ? So what's the difference between tissue? What's the difference between organ? So keep that in mind and think about it as you're working in lab this week. The human body has 4 different types of tissue: epithelium, connective, nervous, and muscle. And of course it's not that straightforward because each of those 4 types have subtypes. So there's actually quite a few examples that we have to work through this week. Okay. And one thing that I'm also not mentioning, but would be a good idea for you and your lab mates to discuss, is what is extracellular matrix? What is it? Why is it important? And how does it relate to the tissue, especially connective tissue? Okay. So on the next few slides, or this one and moving forward, I'm going to talk about each of those 4 and introduce you to their subtypes. So let's begin with epithelium, also called epithelial tissue. Wide variety of function for epithelial tissue, including protection, absorption, filtration, secretion, and also sensory reception, so very diverse. Epithelial tissue occurs throughout the body. So hopefully you know that your skin is a type of epithelial tissue, so it's covering our body's surface. But in addition to the skin, epithelial tissue is present in any lining of a body cavity. Okay? And it's also, there's a layer of epithelial tissue that surrounds each organ. There are many characteristics for epithelial tissue, and just a couple that I want to mention here. So polarity, or epithelial tissue is polarized. So on one side there's an apical membrane, and on the other side there's a basal membrane. One side faces the outside, one side faces the inside. And why this is important is because it often relates to specialization of function. The apical side will do something that the basal side cannot, and vice versa. Epithelial tissue has an underlying layer of connective tissue almost always. Epithelial tissue is avascular, so it contains no blood vessels. It does not have a blood supply, but it is innervated, so it has cells and tissue of the nervous system. And many epithelial tissue examples can regenerate as well. So there's a couple different ways we classify epithelial tissue, and let's talk about those. So the first one is arrangement. So if epithelial tissue has one layer, then it is referred to as simple. If it has more than one layer, it's called stratified. But that's not the only way we classify epithelium. We also look at the individual shape of the epithelial cells. So if the cell appears very flat, then we call it squamous. And this is what it might look like under a microscope slide. So very thin, very flat. Epithelial tissue might be cuboidal in shape. So it might look like a cube. And then the third shape is columnar. So columnar epithelial cells are very tall and probably pretty skinny. Okay. So those are the two major ways that we classify. And of course, there are a couple examples that don't quite fit within this classification. And so we call that pseudostratified and transitional. And I'll get to that here in a second. I do want to point out, so when it comes to simple, you can have epithelial tissue that is simple squamous, simple cuboidal, or simple columnar. You can also have cells that are stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, or stratified columnar. So 6 possibilities from these combinations. So let's look at a few examples. I'm going to show you the 3 types of simple epithelium. Now I'm going to move quickly through this because this is what you'll spend a lot of time in lab this week going over the different tissues and what they appear like under the microscope. Okay. So we've got the 3 types of simple. We've got simple squamous, so it's 1 layer, very flat. Good example of this is cells in your lungs, your alveolar cells. They allow for diffusion of gases. Next type, simple cuboidal. So these cells shown here, they're very cube-shaped in appearance. This is probably a better example right here, but it's still just 1 layer. Kidney is a good example of this, kidney tubules. Third type of simple epithelium is columnar. Okay, so very tall, very thin. Okay, so if I had to outline it here, we've got individual cells that look like this, but also notice how their nuclei are relatively uniform in location. So keep this in mind when I introduce the pseudostratified epithelium. Okay, so those are the first 3. Moving on to the stratified epithelium. Again, we have 3 types of those. First one, we've got stratified squamous. So these cells are still flat, but there's multiple layers of them. Okay. Good example of this is the skin. Stratified squamous are good for protecting underlying tissues, so it's protection, absorbing, or cushioning, I should say. So skin and various other skin and esophagus, mouth, they often have multiple layers of squamous epithelium. Next type, cuboidal epithelium. Okay, so usually just a couple layers here. So a couple layers of cube-shaped cells, really good for protection. Many glands, mammary glands, salivary glands will have this appearance here, 2 layers of cuboidal epithelial cells. And then the third type of stratified is the columnar. Okay. Now, it may or may not have an underlying layer of cuboidal cells, but the defining feature is that that layer on the outside is columnar in appearance. A little difficult to see here because we can't zoom in, but this layer that faces the outside, the apical side, is columnar. Okay. This tissue is pretty rare, provides a role for protection and secretion, but does not occur in very many places in the body, the best example being the male urethra and enlarged ducts of some of the glands. Okay, so those are the 6 types, simple and stratified, but the other 2 don't really quite fit those categories, and they are pseudostratified and transitional. So pseudostratified, still 1 layer. Okay, so look at this cartoon, it's still 1 layer, but it's trying to trick you because you see how the nuclei aren't aligned like they were previously in the columnar. So you may look at that and think, oh, there's actually a couple layers here, but really the cells go from the basal side to the apical side, and it's 1 layer. Good example of this is the trachea. Usually these cells are secreting substances. And then the last type of epithelium is transitional. And transitional kind of resembles both stratified, squamous, and cuboidal, so it's kind of rounded, maybe square in appearance, multiple layers. It's really hard to define, but the reason for this is because transitional epithelium is really good at stretching and permitting distension. Because of this, it's located in the urinary system, so it lines the ureters and bladder and part of the urethra. So that gets us through the epithelial tissue. Moving on to the second type of tissue in the human body, and that is connective tissue. Students often struggle the most with identifying or wrapping their heads around connective tissue, and that's because it's a very large group of tissue that provides many different roles for the body. Okay, so you'll probably spend a little extra time on this type of tissue compared to the other ones. In general, connective tissue is protecting, supporting, and insulating or binding to other tissues of the body. An example, ligaments bind bones together. Location, widely distributed across the entire body. In fact, it's the most abundant tissue type in the human body. And just like epithelial tissue, it is subdivided. There are 4 major subtypes of connective tissue. So the first is what we call connective tissue proper, which is also further divided into loose connective tissue or dense connective tissue. Second type of connective tissue is cartilage, and it has hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, or fibrocartilage. And then the third and fourth are a little more straightforward, bone tissue and blood. So you may not think of those as connective tissue, but they are in fact. So let's go through the types of connective tissue. I'll start with loose connective tissue. So-called loose because all 3 of them are not very dense. In appearance, they're very loose. They're not very compact. Okay, so the first type of loose connective tissue is what we call areolar. So areolar, kind of gel-like. The cells of areolar tissue secrete a very loose matrix, and really the function of areolar tissue is to cushion and kind of support other cells, in particular epithelial cells. So a lot of times you'll find an underlying layer of areolar tissue beneath the epithelium. Second type is adipose. Okay, adipose is also called fat cells. Okay, fat cells are really good at providing energy as a backup source. Fat cells also insulate and help us help prevent heat loss, and also is good for protecting our internal organs. Distributed widely throughout the body, there's fat underneath our skin, around our internal organs, and in the breasts. The third type of loose connective tissue is reticular. And reticular tissue is really good for supporting especially cells of the immune system. So that's why reticular tissue is almost always found in lymphoid organs or organs of the immune system, such as lymph nodes, bone marrow, and spleen. Moving on to dense connective tissue, again we have 3 types. We have dense regular, which is primarily composed of collagen, okay, type of matrix, and dense regular is really good for providing attachment, so muscles attaching to bones or bones attaching to other bones, and the reason dense regular is used because it's really good at providing a tensile strength. The second type is dense irregular, so it still is primarily composed of collagen, but notice that the overall appearance is not as highly organized as the dense regular. So, but it's still pretty strong and able to withstand tension, especially tension applied in many different directions. So because of this, dense irregular tissue can be found in areas like fibrous capsules of organs that protecting organs and especially joints, protecting sensitive areas of our body. Third type of connective tissue or dense connective tissue is elastic, composed primarily of something called elastic fibers, and elastic fibers are really good for recoil. Okay. So this tissue can really stretch, but after stretching, it just recoils back to its original position. So good example of this are large arteries, including the aorta, because as the aorta receives all the cardiac output from the heart, it expands, but then it's got to contract back into its original shape. Moving on to the third type of connective tissue, and that is cartilage. So cartilage has 3 different examples, but pretty easily identified. So the first is hyaline, and all cartilage is composed of these cells called chondrocytes. And chondrocytes secrete the matrix that compose cartilage, or make up the cartilage tissue. And these chondrocytes, they reside in something called a lacuna. So all 3 of these have chondrocytes that reside in a lacuna. So if you see this appearance, then you know it's cartilage. But there's a couple different ways to identify between the 3. Hyaline is really good for supporting and reinforcing, especially cushioning structures. So because of that, a good example of hyaline cartilage are the costal cartilages that attach the rib bones to the sternum. Second type is elastic cartilage. Similar in appearance, still has chondrocytes in the lacuna, but it's really the presence of the elastic fibers, those dark purple elastic fibers. And because elastin is there, it's going to provide a little more flexibility than the hyaline. And a good example of elastic cartilage is your ear. It's composed mostly of this type of tissue. Third type of cartilage is fibrocartilage. Still has chondrocytes in the lacuna, but easily identified because of the blue appearance. It's a slightly different type of collagen, but really good at providing tensile strength, and a good example of this are the intervertebral discs between the vertebrae. All right, so the third type of connective tissue, bones, sometimes called osseous tissue. So very dense calcified matrix, and instead of chondrocytes, bone contains something called osteocytes. So osteocytes, again, reside within lacuna, not chondrocytes, osteocytes. They secrete the matrix that eventually composes the bones, makes them very dense. Bones do a lot of different things for our body, beyond just providing the structural support. And the last type of connective tissue is blood. So blood is composed of red and white blood cells, and those are found within the fluid compartment portion of your blood, aka the plasma. And its role is to transport gases, nutrients, etc. And hopefully you know that blood is contained within blood vessels. All right, so that gets us through connective tissue. Let's talk about the third type of tissue in the body, and that is nervous tissue. So nervous tissue is really specialized for receiving stimuli and generating electrical signals, aka action potentials. So there are another type of cells that compose nervous tissue, and they are called neuroglia. There's several different types that we're not going into, but neuroglia, their various forms all protect, support, and insulate these sensitive neurons. Nervous tissue is restricted to the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. And just some general characteristics like I mentioned above, they receive and transmit electrical signals, therefore we call them sometimes excitable cells. Another characteristic, neurons, they can be short, but neurons can be very long. In fact, the largest cell in our body is a type of neuron, and it's almost, I think, 3 feet long. Your lab manual only shows this photo, and we'll start out with just a typical neuron. shown here. Okay, so you have this cell body containing a large nucleus, one of them, and neurons have these projections, or what your book is calling processes, and these are the axons or the dendrites, and notice how they're all connected to each other, so kind of spider web in appearance. And also shown in the photo, but not really emphasized, it says nuclei of supporting cells. So all these other cells that surround the neurons, there are various types of neuroglia. The last type of tissue is muscle tissue. In general, muscle tissue is really good at providing contraction, but it's more than just the body movement. So contraction of muscle tissue allows for blood to flow and our internal organs to function properly, especially with digestion. Location, so muscles, or what is also referred to more properly, skeletal muscle, muscle of the heart, and walls of the hollow organs. We'll get into that here in a second. Characteristics, difficult to kind of put into a couple categories. Muscle tissue in general appears striated or banded, but with a caveat that this is skeletal and cardiac only. Muscle cells tend to be long or elongated, and they too, like neurons, they are excitable, so they receive and transmit electrical signals. So let's look at the three types of muscle real quickly. The first type is skeletal muscle. Okay, easily identified, very long and cylindrical in shape. So this is one muscle cell right here, and I kind of marked through it, but you can see that it is multinucleated. It has multiple nuclei. But the easiest way to identify skeletal muscle are those striations, or those bands shown here. Okay, so to me, I look at a slide of skeletal muscle and it appears very organized, very striated. And skeletal muscle is used for voluntary movement, okay, found throughout our body in all skeletal muscle locations. A little bit different is cardiac muscle. Okay, so cardiac muscle, like skeletal muscle, it appears striated, but it may not be as obvious. Maybe it may look a little disorganized. And that's also due to these branches shown here. Okay. But cardiac muscle, just like skeletal muscle, allows for contraction, but cardiac muscle is only found within the walls of the heart. Okay, only found there. Another thing to point out for cardiac muscle are the presence of these intercalated discs. Let me show them. So intercalated discs shown here, kind of these darker bands, which we'll get into that more so in lecture and later in 242. The third type of muscle is smooth muscle, probably the one you're least familiar with. And its appearance is quite different than skeletal or cardiac. These cells are more spindle, kind of flattened in shape. They lack the striations, and they have one central nuclei. When skeletal muscle, it still is used for contraction, but contraction of skeletal muscle really is useful for propelling substances or objects, especially in terms of digestion, propelling it forward along internal passageways. Because of this, skeletal muscle is found mostly within the walls of hollow organs, say like your stomach, your small or large intestine. Okay. So that gets us through the classification of tissues, aka histology. And for the remaining half of this talk, we're going to go over the integumentary system, or the skin. Okay, so let's talk about the integumentary system, or skin, and a few accessory organs. And this is covered by exercise 7 in your lab manual. So the integumentary system, it is an organ system, and it provides many different functions to us. So it helps us insulate and cushion underlying body tissue, protects our body from physical harm, helps prevent water loss, helps us regulate our body temperature, provides excretory and metabolic functions, and is a location for various sensory organs like touch. So this figure is really just an overview of our integument, not of nails, and has a little bit of detail for the hair structures. But in general, if we're talking about the skin, the integument, two major divisions. The epidermis is the layer that faces the outside environment, and then we've got the underlying dermis, which notice is much larger compared to the epidermis. But let's talk first about the epidermis, that most superficial layer that is in contact with the outside environment. And the epidermis has 4 sublayers. Notice that there's 5 if we're talking about what we call thick skin, or skin of the palms or the base of our feet. But starting at the most interior layer, we have the stratum basale, and moving outward, we then encounter the stratum spinosum, the stratum granulosum, the stratum corneum, and if it is thick skin, then it will have a 5th layer, that stratum lucidium. So let's look at the epidermis. So I had this figure from earlier shown here, and if we're talking just the epidermis, this very thin superficial layer, if we zoomed in here, this is what it would look like, hopefully, under microscope. We have the most interior layer here, the stratum basale. Most of the epidermis is this 2nd layer here, the stratum spinosum, growing, and these are epithelial cells that are growing and migrating outward. And then you have the stratum granulosum and stratum corneum, which is mostly dead epithelial cells. Okay, so if we think about how our skin grows, and we all know that we shed skin, this layer down here is where new cells are forming, and as they grow, they migrate outwards, and as they get closer to the surface, then those cells are primarily dead, and then we slough them off in the form of this stratum corneum. But the epidermis is not just composed of epithelial cells. There are a few other cells worth mentioning that provide a really important role, and they are keratinocytes. These are cells that are secreting keratin, which is a protein that is providing that strength and durability to our epidermis. The next type are dendritic cells, and these really are cells of the immune system, and they're there kind of surveying the skin for foreign invaders, including viruses and bacteria, and they'll hopefully destroy them. The next are melanocytes, which secrete pigment called melanin. Okay, and melanin down here is this pigment, and it kind of acts as like an umbrella layer to these cells on the most interior layer and prevents them from damage by the sun. Next type of cell are tactile cells. Okay, and so these are important for touch. There are nerve cells here embedded within the skin, and they provide some feedback for us on touch sensation. But of course, by and large, the most abundant type of cells found within the epidermis are epithelial cells. Okay, moving deeper into the skin, we encounter the dermis, and it's the largest layer. And this layer is a layer of connective tissue. It's directly under the epidermis, and it is divided into 2 subdivisions, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. Papillary layer is shown here, and notice how thin it is. It's really this layer right here that runs directly underneath the epidermis. And then you have a much larger reticular layer, and it has a lot more going on in this layer. So let's talk about each of them pretty quickly. Papillary layer is that thinnest, most superficial layer of the dermis, and it is attached directly to the epidermis via these structures called the papillae. And this attachment is uneven, okay? And this is actually what produces the ridges and forms fingerprints. So the epidermis doesn't produce fingerprints, it's actually the underlying dermis, and it's the papillary layer, and I'll show that here in a second. Now the epidermis was avascularized, but the papillary layer does have a blood supply, And in addition to that, it has pain and touch sensors. So let's look at the papillary layer. Again, very thin layer here, and it is providing the attachment to the epidermis via the papillae, shown here, these little ridges. That produces the fingerprints. But notice right here, these are sensory nerve fibers, so pain and touch. That's why if you even just barely cut your skin, it's going to be painful because you have nerve fibers there. Okay, moving deeper into the dermis, we encounter the reticular layer. It's a much larger layer, and in addition, it contains sweat glands, sebaceous or oil glands, and also hair follicles. This layer is highly vascularized. That's why when you cut your skin, you likely bleed a lot, is because both the papillary and reticular layer are vascularized. And in addition, it also contains sensors for pressure, what we call lamellar receptors. So I'm going to go back to that figure. We've got the reticular layer here. It's got a lot of blood vessels. It's got hair follicles. And a lot of times associated with hair follicles are those sebaceous or oil glands. And we've also got some lamellar or pressure sensors here. Okay. So that's a quick overview on the epidermis and the dermis. And the next few slides are going to focus on what we call accessory structures of the integumentary system: nails, hairs, and cutaneous glands. Okay. So nails compose mostly of keratin, but nail cells are considered mostly non-living because it's almost all keratin. And keratin is really what's providing that strength and structure of the nails. So a few functions of nails: they protect our distal phalanx, which is a fancy term for fingertip. And in addition, the nails also provide a role in precise movement and grip of our fingertips. So let's go over a few of the basic components of a nail. The body is the largest part of a nail, composed of nail cells that contain mostly keratin, so it's providing that strength and structure, the protection of your fingertips. The end of the body is what's called the free edge. That helps us with grip. Underneath the free edge is this structure called the hyponychium. And the actual growing part of the nail is contained down here in what's called the root. You can't see most of the root, but the part that you can see is this structure called the lunule, and it's this white half-moon shaped structure. And so these are nail cells that are actually growing and migrating out. So it's worth mentioning that if you damage either the root or the lunule, then your nail may not grow properly afterwards. The part that is producing the new cells of the nail is actually the matrix, shown here. And underneath that is what we have, what's called the nail bed, and this is providing the nourishment to the entire nail structure. Moving on to the second accessory organ, that is hair. So hairs are enclosed within this structure called the follicles, which are formed by both epidermis and dermis structures. And hairs are divided into two major regions. The part that's above the skin is called the shaft. The part that is below the skin is called the root. And there's actually a lot going on down here. In addition to the root, this area here, you also have a couple other structures. You have this muscle that is called the erector pili, and it is responsible for the hairs either laying down more flat or standing more straight up. And you also have some glands, sebaceous glands, that secrete a substance called sebum into the shaft here, which provides nourishment to the skin and the hair. So hairs, the function of hair, so they help us regulate temperature, but also sensory detection. As you all know, you lightly brush your fingers over your arm, And if you have hairs there, then you can detect that. That's sensory detection. So let's go over a few structures of a hair. So we're talking the root here, and you have a layer that's called the external epithelial sheath and the internal epithelial sheath that are providing protection to the growing hair. Then you have this area within here that's called the root, and there's a very thin cuticle layer here, and moving deeper inside you have a cortex area, and then the innermost part of the hair is called the medulla. And this is all the growing hair cells. They're migrating out, and the part that is producing new cells is what's called the matrix, okay, the hair matrix. It is supported by this structure here called the papilla, so it's providing nourishment to the matrix, but there's also a layer of melanocytes, again providing pigment that's providing protection to the matrix and the root of the hair, and depending on the type of pigment that is produced by the melanocytes, that determines your hair color. The last accessory gland of the integument are cutaneous glands. And there are two types of glands found in the integument: the sebaceous, or commonly called oil glands, and then sweat glands. Okay? So most sebaceous glands are associated with hair follicles, not always, but most of the time. While sweat glands, they open directly onto the skin surface, and because of that they're often called a pore, so a sweat pore. Sebaceous glands, like I mentioned earlier, they produce that oil substance, and it's called sebum, and the sebum moisturizes the hair and also the skin. And most of the times it'll empty into a hair follicle, but sometimes sebaceous glands will empty directly onto the skin. But they are widely distributed. They're found everywhere except those thick-skinned areas, the palms and the feet. Sweat glands, a little more complicated than that. They're outlets onto the skin, we call those pores. And there are two different types of sweat glands that I want to mention. And they're organized or characterized by the composition of their secretion, because the secretions are not the same. The first type is what we call eccrine sweat glands, and they produce a clear perspiration, and it's important for thermoregulation. So as we sweat, that sweat evaporates, and that evaporation cools our blood and hopefully cools our body down. These are widely distributed. Almost all parts of our skin contain these eccrine sweat glands. But there's a second type called apocrine, and they produce the clear perspiration as well, but in addition, they produce a protein and fat-rich secretion. And these apocrine glands are restricted to the axillary or armpit areas and the genital areas. And it's due to the presence of this protein and fat-rich secretion that when you sweat, and let's say it's been a while before you've showered, then you kind of get that musty odor that's associated with sweat, and that is due to the apocrine sweat glands. So that gets us through your pre-lab video, where we've gone over the classification of tissues, aka histology, and I introduced to you the integumentary system, the epidermis, the underlying dermis, and some associated structures. All right, that covers the material for this week's lab. Be sure to read through your lab workbook and complete all the activities, especially paying attention to the microscope and all those different types of tissue that you will need to know. Good luck.